Samantha Garcia's heart pounded as she was dragged into the cold, imposing mansion of Regis Montenegro, the enigmatic billionaire with a fearsome reputation. His piercing gaze swept over her, making her feel vulnerable but not defeated. Samantha, known for her fiery personality, refused to show fear, even in the face of the man who seemed determined to break her spirit. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" she spat, her voice dripping with defiance. Regis, unfazed, smirked. "Do you?" Their confrontation was electric. Regis accused Samantha of being involved in a scheme that cost his company millions, branding her as nothing more than a manipulative opportunist. Samantha, however, vehemently denied the allegations, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said boldly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Regis leaned in close, his voice dangerously low. "You'll stay here until I get the truth. And trust me, Samantha, you won't leave until I've taught you a lesson about loyalty." Confined to Regis's sprawling estate, Samantha refused to play the role of a helpless victim. She explored her surroundings, noting the high fences, numerous guards, and the sheer opulence of the place. Despite the luxurious setting, she felt trapped and yearned for her freedom. Regis's staff, intimidated by his authority, treated her with a mix of disdain and pity. One of the guards, Chad, took pleasure in taunting her, trying to instill fear. But Samantha stood her ground, her sharp wit often leaving him speechless. During one heated encounter, Regis overheard Samantha standing up to Chad. Amused yet irritated by her audacity, he intervened. "You're fearless, I'll give you that," Regis said, his voice tinged with mockery. "But bravery without wisdom is just recklessness." Samantha shot back, "And power without compassion is just cruelty." Her words struck a nerve, but Regis quickly masked his reaction. He couldn't understand why this woman, who he believed was guilty, intrigued him so much. Days turned into a battle of wills between Samantha and Regis. He assigned her menial tasks on his estate, hoping to humble her. But Samantha approached each task with determination, refusing to let him see her falter. Her resilience only fueled Regis's frustration and admiration. One evening, Samantha confronted Regis directly, demanding to know why he was so determined to break her. "What do you get out of this, Regis? Do you enjoy watching people suffer?" Regis's eyes darkened. "I don't enjoy it, Samantha, but I can't let betrayal go unpunished." "Then punish the right person," she shot back, her voice filled with righteous anger. "I'm innocent and deep down, you know it." Regis was momentarily taken aback by her conviction. Could he have been wrong about her? The thought unsettled him. Despite the tension, an unspoken connection began to form between them. Regis couldn't deny the fire in Samantha's eyes, a fire that refused to be extinguished. And Samantha, though she despised him, couldn't ignore the moments when his mask slipped, revealing a man haunted by his own demons. Samantha's first few days at Regis's estate were filled with hostility and tension. Regis was determined to keep her in check, assigning her grueling tasks to break her spirit. However, Samantha tackled every challenge with grit, refusing to let him see her crumble. Whether it was tending to the vast gardens under the scorching sun or cleaning the stables where his prized horses resided, Samantha never wavered. "Is this what you do to all your enemies, Regis?" she sneered one day, sweat dripping down her forehead as she raked leaves. Regis stood nearby, his arms crossed, a faint smirk playing on his lips, only to the ones who refused to admit their mistakes. "Then you're wasting your time," Samantha shot back, her fiery gaze locked on his. "Because I've done nothing wrong." Their exchanges became a daily battle of wits, each one more charged than the last. Regis found himself both infuriated and intrigued by her resilience. She wasn't like anyone he had ever encountered. One night, Samantha sat by the window of the small guest room she had been assigned. The moonlight streamed in, illuminating her tired face. Her thoughts drifted to the life she had left behind, a life filled with independence and dreams. Why had she been dragged into Regis's world? Why was she being punished for something she didn't do? As she pondered these questions, she overheard a conversation between Regis and his right-hand man, Chad. "We still haven't found solid proof against her," Chad admitted hesitantly. Regis's voice was cold and unwavering. "Keep looking. There's something about her. I can't shake the feeling she's hiding something." Samantha's fists clenched. She wanted to burst into the room and confront him, but she knew it would only add fuel to the fire. Instead, she vowed to prove her innocence, no matter how long it took. The days passed, and Samantha began to notice subtle changes in Regis. He was still as controlling and authoritative as ever, but there were moments when his facade cracked, revealing glimpses of vulnerability. One evening, as Samantha finished her tasks, she found herself in the estate's library. It was a sprawling room filled with shelves of books, a stark contrast to the man who seemed so consumed by power and control. Regis entered the room, surprised to see her there. "What are you doing here?" Samantha held up a book, her tone light but defiant. "Trying to remember what it feels like to be human. You should try it sometime." Regis's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "You have quite the mouth on you, don't you? And you have quite the ego," she shot back. Their banter was sharp, but there was a softness to it that neither of them acknowledged. In that brief moment, the walls between them seemed to waver. Later that night, Regis found himself staring out the window, his thoughts consumed by Samantha. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, stubborn, infuriating, and undeniably captivating. Days turned into weeks, and Samantha's defiance remained unshaken. Despite the oppressive conditions Regis imposed, her fiery personality shone brighter than ever. Regis, used to unquestioned obedience, found himself both irritated and fascinated by her unwavering spirit. One morning, Samantha was tasked with cleaning the stables. As she worked, Chad appeared, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Still holding out, huh?" he taunted. "You're tougher than most, I'll give you that. But everyone breaks eventually." Samantha straightened, meeting his gaze with a defiant smile. "Maybe it's time someone taught you that not everyone can be broken." Chad's smirk faltered, and Regis, watching from a distance, felt an unexpected surge of pride in Samantha's resilience. Though he wouldn't admit it, her strength was beginning to challenge his perception of her. Later that day, Regis confronted Samantha, his tone laced with frustration. "You're awfully confident for someone in your position," he remarked. Samantha met his piercing gaze, her voice steady. "And you're awfully threatened for someone so powerful." For a moment, Regis was silent, the air between them charged. But instead of retaliating, he walked away, leaving Samantha to wonder what she had gotten herself into. That evening, Samantha found herself in the library once more. It had become her sanctuary in the otherwise hostile environment of Regis's estate. As she perused the shelves, she stumbled upon a photo album tucked away in a corner. Curiosity piqued, she opened it, revealing pictures of a young Regis with his family. His eyes, so cold and calculating now, were filled with warmth and innocence in the photographs. "What are you doing?" Regis's voice startled her, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to pry," Samantha said, closing the album. "I just didn't expect to see this side of you." Regis walked over, taking the album from her hands. "That side doesn't exist anymore." Samantha hesitated, then asked, "What happened to you?" Regis's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Samantha thought he wouldn't answer. But then he spoke, his voice low and filled with bitterness. "Life happened, betrayal happened, and I learned the hard way that trusting people is a mistake." Samantha saw a flicker of pain in his eyes and, for the first time, felt a twinge of empathy for him. She realized that beneath his harsh exterior was a man scarred by his past, though he tried desperately to hide it. The following days brought a subtle shift in the dynamic between Samantha and Regis. While their arguments were still frequent, they lacked the venom they once held. Instead, their exchanges carried an underlying tension, one neither of them could ignore. During one heated debate, Samantha finally snapped. "Why are you so determined to make me suffer, Regis? What do you gain from this?" Regis's gaze softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again. "You think I enjoy this? You think I like doubting everyone around me? I don't, but I can't afford to let my guard down." "Maybe you should try," Samantha said quietly. "Not everyone is out to hurt you." Her words lingered in Regis's mind long after their conversation ended. That night, he found himself replaying their exchanges, questioning his actions and the assumptions he had made about her. Meanwhile, Samantha began to see cracks in Regis's armor. She realized that beneath his cold exterior was a man who had been deeply hurt, a man who built walls around himself to keep the world out. Their relationship was no longer black and white. The lines between captor and captive, enemy and ally, began to blur, setting the stage for an emotional reckoning neither of them could anticipate. A thunderstorm loomed over the estate, casting an eerie atmosphere across the property. Samantha had been assigned an exhausting task in the greenhouse, tending to Regis's prized plants despite the impending weather. The wind howled outside as rain lashed against the glass panels, yet Samantha worked with a determination that surprised even herself. Regis found her there, her hands covered in soil, her hair damp from the humidity. "You should be inside," he said, his voice cutting through the storm's roar. Samantha barely looked at him. "You were the one who gave me this task. Do you expect me to leave it unfinished?" For a moment, Regis said nothing, his piercing gaze locked on her. She was soaked, exhausted, and yet she still managed to challenge him with her fierce defiance. "You're stubborn," he muttered. "And you're insufferable," she retorted. A crack of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. Samantha flinched slightly, and Regis noticed. "You're afraid of the storm," he said, almost amused. "I'm not afraid," she shot back, though her trembling hands betrayed her. Without a word, Regis grabbed her arm and led her back to the mansion. Samantha resisted at first, but the storm's fury made her relent. Inside, he handed her a towel, his usual cold demeanor softened by an unspoken concern. "Why do you care?" Samantha asked, her voice quieter than usual. Regis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared out the window, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted finally, leaving her stunned. The storm raged on, trapping everyone indoors. Regis spent most of the day in his study, poring over documents, but his thoughts constantly drifted to Samantha. There was something about her that unsettled him. Her defiance, her strength. It reminded him of the man he used to be before betrayal hardened him. Meanwhile, Samantha roamed the mansion, her curiosity getting the better of her. She found herself in a grand hall filled with paintings and photographs. One picture caught her attention, a young Regis, smiling with a woman she assumed was his mother. "You're nosy," Regis's voice came from behind her, startling her. She turned to face him, unflinching. "You have a habit of sneaking up on people." He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the photograph she was staring at. "That was a long time ago." "What happened to her?" Samantha asked softly, sensing the pain in his tone. "She died," Regis replied shortly, "and with her, any hope I had for trusting people." Samantha wanted to say something, but the vulnerability in his voice left her speechless. For the first time, she saw Regis not as her tormentor but as a man carrying a heavy burden. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment, her voice sincere. Regis looked at her, surprised by her compassion. It was a rare thing in his world, and it stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. The storm passed, but the tension between Samantha and Regis remained. Their interactions were charged, each one a battle of wills and emotions. One evening, the estate hosted a formal dinner for Regis's business associates. Samantha, much to her dismay, was ordered to serve the guests. She entered the grand dining room wearing a simple black dress, her head held high despite the humiliation she felt. Regis watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable. She moved with grace, her defiance simmering just beneath the surface. One of the guests, a middle-aged businessman, made a crude remark about her appearance. Samantha froze, her fists clenched at her sides. Before she could respond, Regis's voice cut through the room. "You will treat my staff with respect," he said, his tone icy. The room fell silent, and the guest quickly muttered an apology. Samantha shot Regis a glance, confused by his sudden act of chivalry. Later that night, as she cleared the table, Regis approached her. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "No one disrespects you under my roof." Samantha didn't know how to respond. For all his harshness, Regis had moments like these that left her questioning everything she thought she knew about him. As she lay in bed that night, her mind raced. Regis was an enigma, a man who could be both cruel and kind, cold and protective. And despite everything, she couldn't deny the growing connection between them. A connection that scared her more than anything else. Days turned into weeks, yet the tension between Samantha and Regis only grew more intense. Samantha's defiance hadn't wavered, and Regis's icy demeanor continued to clash with her fiery spirit. Yet beneath their constant sparring, an undeniable chemistry simmered. One evening, Regis summoned Samantha to his private library. The room was dimly lit, its walls lined with books that seemed untouched. Samantha stood by the door, her arms crossed. "What now?" she asked, her tone impatient. Regis leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her. "You're getting too comfortable here." "And whose fault is that?" she shot back. "You've kept me here against my will." He smirked, an expression that both infuriated and intrigued her. "If you want to leave so badly, why haven't you tried harder?" Samantha's mouth opened, but no words came out. He wasn't entirely wrong. Despite her anger and frustration, she hadn't attempted an escape recently. Perhaps it was the growing curiosity she felt about him, or the strange safety she felt in his presence, no matter how much she hated to admit it. "Because you'd find me," she finally said, her voice softer. Regis's expression shifted, just for a moment, into something almost vulnerable. "You're right, I would." Regis's estate buzzed with activity as preparations for a lavish party began. Samantha learned from the staff that it was an annual gathering for Regis's high-profile business associates. "You're attending," Regis announced casually as they crossed paths in the hallway. Samantha blinked, confused. "What?" "You heard me. You'll be by my side at the party." She laughed bitterly. "You're joking. What could I possibly contribute to your billionaire gathering?" Regis stepped closer, his towering frame intimidating. "I'm not asking, Samantha. Consider it part of your punishment." The night of the party arrived, and Samantha begrudgingly stepped into the ballroom wearing a sleek dress Regis had chosen for her. It hugged her figure perfectly, its emerald green color accentuating her fiery eyes. She hated how good it made her feel. As she descended the staircase, the room fell silent. All eyes were on her, and she could feel the weight of their judgment. Regis stood at the bottom of the stairs, offering her his arm. "Don't embarrass me," he murmured, a teasing smile playing on his lips. Samantha glared at him, but took his arm nonetheless. Throughout the evening, Samantha surprised herself with how well she navigated the room. She engaged in polite conversations with influential figures, her sharp wit earning a few impressed glances. Regis, watching from a distance, felt an unfamiliar sense of pride. Toward the end of the night, one of Regis's business rivals approached Samantha, his intentions anything but professional. "You're quite the catch," the man said, leaning too close. Samantha stiffened, but before she could respond, Regis appeared, his presence commanding. "Back off," Regis said, his voice low and dangerous. The man backed away, muttering apologies. Regis turned to Samantha, his jaw tight. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softening. I can handle myself, she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. Regis placed a hand on her back, guiding her away from the crowd. Not while you're with me, he said. No one will touch you. After the party, the tension between Samantha and Regis shifted. The walls they had built around themselves began to crumble, though neither would admit it. Late one night, Samantha found Regis sitting by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked lost in thought, the usual sharpness in his eyes replaced by something softer. Couldn't sleep? She asked, leaning against the doorframe. Regis glanced at her but didn't reply. She took it as an invitation and sat across from him. You act like you have everything under control, she said after a moment. But you don't, do you? Regis chuckled bitterly. You think you've figured me out? I think you're human, she replied. He looked at her, his gaze intense. You're wrong. I stopped being human a long time ago. Samantha frowned. Why do you hate yourself so much? For the first time, Regis seemed caught off guard. He stared into the fire, his grip on the glass tightening. Because I've done things I'm not proud of, he admitted, and I've paid the price. Samantha's heart ached at his confession. Despite his arrogance and cruelty, there was a deep pain within him, one she couldn't ignore. You're not as bad as you think, she said softly. Regis looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. For the first time, there was no anger, no sarcasm, just two people trying to understand each other. As Samantha left the room, she realized that her feelings for Regis were far more complicated than she wanted to admit. Samantha couldn't deny that her time at Regis's estate was changing her. The walls she had carefully built around herself were beginning to crack, just as Regis's cold exterior was softening. Despite their constant sparring, moments of tenderness between them were becoming more frequent and harder to ignore. One morning, Samantha was in the garden, enjoying the rare quiet. She had discovered a hidden corner filled with blooming roses, and it had become her sanctuary. Regis found her there, leaning against the archway with a small smile. You've been avoiding me, he remarked. Samantha glanced at him, her expression guarded. Maybe I just needed some space. Regis stepped closer, his presence as commanding as ever. You've been here for weeks. I thought you'd be trying harder to escape by now. Samantha crossed her arms. What's the point? You just find me again. Besides, maybe I've realized there's more to you than meets the eye. Regis raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Is that so? She hesitated before responding, her voice soft. You're not as heartless as you pretend to be. For a moment, Regis looked vulnerable, caught off guard by her words. But before she could press further, his mask of indifference slipped back into place. You're wrong, he said, his tone cold. I am exactly what I appear to be. Regis received an urgent call that evening, summoning him to his office in the city. Samantha, curious and restless, decided to explore the estate in his absence. She wandered into his private study, a room he had always kept locked. To her surprise, the door was ajar. Inside, Samantha discovered a collection of documents and photographs spread across his desk. Most were related to his business dealings, but one photo caught her eye. It was a picture of a younger Regis, smiling warmly with a woman beside him. She looked strikingly beautiful, her arm looped through his. Enjoying yourself? Samantha whirled around to find Regis standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I didn't mean to. To invade my privacy? He finished for her, his voice icy. He strode toward her, his towering presence making her feel small. I was just curious, she admitted, clutching the photograph. Who is she? Regis's jaw tightened. For a moment, Samantha thought he wouldn't answer. She was someone important to me, he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. But she's gone now. Samantha's heart ached at the pain in his voice. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. I'm sorry. Regis stared at her hand for a moment before pulling away. Don't be. It doesn't change anything. But it did. The air between them shifted, their connection growing deeper despite Regis's attempts to keep her at a distance. A week later, a powerful storm hit the estate, trapping Samantha and Regis inside together. The rain lashed against the windows, and the electricity flickered on and off. The tension between them was palpable. Samantha sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance. Regis joined her, holding 2 glasses of wine. He handed her one without a word and sat down beside her. "You're surprisingly quiet tonight," Samantha observed, taking a sip of her drink. Regis stared into the fire, his expression distant. "Storms remind me of my childhood. My father used to lock me in the basement during storms, claiming it was to toughen me up." Samantha's heart clenched. She had never seen Regis so vulnerable. "That's awful," she said softly. He shrugged, his voice bitter. "It worked. I learned not to fear anything or anyone." Samantha reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "You don't have to pretend with me, Regis. You don't have to carry all this alone." He looked at her, his icy facade melting away. For the first time, Samantha saw the man beneath the armor, the man who had been hurt, betrayed, and abandoned. Without thinking, she leaned closer, her lips brushing against his. Regis froze for a moment before pulling her into a passionate kiss, his hands tangling in her hair. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "This changes nothing," Regis said, though his voice lacked conviction. Samantha smiled softly. "Keep telling yourself that." But they both knew it wasn't true. The storm outside mirrored the storm within them, a whirlwind of emotions they could no longer ignore. The aftermath of their kiss left Samantha and Regis walking on eggshells around each other. Regis, true to his word, pretended as though nothing had changed. He resumed his cold and commanding demeanor, though Samantha caught glimpses of hesitation in his actions. Samantha, however, was growing tired of his games. One morning, as they passed each other in the hallway, she grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "Are we seriously going to act like nothing happened?" she demanded, her eyes blazing. Regis looked at her, his face impassive. "Nothing did happen, Samantha. You're imagining things." Her jaw tightened, anger bubbling to the surface. "You can lie to yourself all you want, but don't insult me by pretending you didn't feel it too." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Feel what? You think one kiss changes everything? It doesn't. I've seen what happens when you let emotions get in the way. I won't let it happen again." Samantha refused to back down, meeting his glare head-on. "You're scared, Regis. You hide behind your cold facade because it's easier than dealing with your feelings. But you can't keep running forever." Before he could respond, Samantha stormed off, leaving him standing in the hallway. For the first time in years, Regis felt unsure. Unsure of his control, his emotions, and most of all, the woman who had turned his world upside down. Regis's business dealings had always been complicated, but lately, they had become even more perilous. A rival billionaire, Lorenzo, was intent on taking over one of Regis's key investments. The rivalry was no longer just about business. It was personal. Samantha accidentally overheard Regis arguing with one of his associates. She lingered outside his office door, her curiosity piqued. "She's becoming a liability," the associate said, "if Lorenzo finds out about her." "That's enough," Regis snapped. "Samantha is under my protection. No one touches her." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She pushed the door open, her expression a mix of anger and confusion. "What am I, Regis? Your prisoner? Your liability? Or just another pawn in your game?" Regis's jaw tightened, but there was something softer in his gaze. "You're none of those things, Samantha, but there are people out there who would use you against me. I'm trying to keep you safe." She crossed her arms, her tone defiant. "I don't need your protection. I can take care of myself." "You don't understand how dangerous this world is," Regis said, his voice low. "Lorenzo would do anything to hurt me, and that includes going after you." Samantha hesitated, her resolve wavering. Despite her frustration with Regis, she couldn't deny the sincerity in his words or the fear in his eyes. Later that night, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As she wandered the estate, a shadow moved in the corner of her eye. Before she could react, a hand clamped over her mouth, pulling her into the darkness. Samantha struggled against her attacker, her heart racing. The man whispered threats in her ear, his grip tightening. "Don't scream, and this will be easier for both of us," he hissed. But Samantha wasn't one to go down without a fight. She stomped on his foot and elbowed him in the stomach, causing him to loosen his grip. She turned to run, but another man stepped into her path. Just as panic set in, a familiar voice rang out. "Let her go." Regis emerged from the shadows, his expression lethal. He was flanked by two of his security guards, each armed and ready. The attackers hesitated, clearly recognizing Regis's power. "This isn't over," one of them spat before disappearing into the night. Regis rushed to Samantha, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm fine, thanks to you." He pulled her into a tight embrace, his composure cracking. "I told you it wasn't safe. You should have listened to me." Samantha clung to him, her earlier defiance forgotten. For the first time, she realized just how dangerous Regis's world truly was, and how much he was willing to risk to protect her. Back at the estate, Regis ordered his security team to double their patrols. He refused to let Samantha out of his sight, his protective instincts taking over. As she sat by the fireplace that evening, wrapped in a blanket, Regis joined her. He handed her a cup of tea, his expression softer than she had ever seen. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Samantha looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "For putting you in danger. For dragging you into my mess." She reached out, placing a hand on his. "You didn't drag me into anything, Regis. I chose to be here, and I'm not going anywhere." Their eyes met, the tension between them replaced by a quiet understanding. The walls around Regis's heart were crumbling, and Samantha was determined to break through them completely. Regis's normally controlled life continued to spiral as his feelings for Samantha deepened. He was a man of rules, discipline, and strategy, but she challenged him in ways he never anticipated. Her defiance was like a mirror reflecting his hidden vulnerabilities, and it was driving him mad. Meanwhile, Samantha was determined to reclaim her independence. Although Regis had ordered tighter security and insisted she stay within the estate, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing herself. The confinement gnawed at her. One afternoon, Samantha approached Regis while he worked in his office, his focus unwavering as he pored over a stack of documents. "We need to talk," she announced, her voice firm. He didn't look up. "I'm busy, Samantha. Whatever it is can wait." "No, it can't," she insisted, marching up to his desk and slamming her hands on it. "I'm not a prisoner here, Regis. You can't keep me locked up forever." His eyes snapped up to meet hers, cold and unyielding. "I'm protecting you." "I didn't ask for your protection," she shot back. "I can take care of myself. You don't own me, Regis." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might snap. Instead, he stood, towering over her as he leaned across the desk. "You think this is about control?" he growled. "You don't understand the kind of danger you're in, Samantha. If I let you leave, you'd be dead in hours." "Then teach me to fight back," she countered, refusing to back down. "If your enemies are coming for me, I deserve to know how to defend myself." Her words struck a chord in Regis. He saw the fire in her eyes, the unrelenting determination that made her so different from anyone he'd ever met. "Fine," he said after a long pause. "But if you want me to train you, you follow my rules. No exceptions." Samantha nodded, her heart racing. She had won a small victory, but she couldn't ignore the way his words lingered in her mind. The lines between protector, captor, and something far more complicated were becoming increasingly blurred. The next morning, Samantha found herself on the estate's training grounds. Regis stood before her, dressed in athletic gear, his demeanor all business. "If you want to defend yourself, you need to start with the basics," he said, tossing her a pair of boxing gloves. Samantha caught them, her brow furrowing. "Boxing? Isn't that a bit old school?" Regis smirked. "Old school works. Now, let's see what you've got." The first hour was grueling. Regis pushed her to her limits, correcting her stance, her punches, and her attitude. "Focus, Samantha," he barked as she missed yet another jab. "I am focusing," she snapped, wiping sweat from her brow. "Then hit harder. If someone's coming at you, they won't hold back. Neither will I." His words spurred her on, and by the end of the session, she was panting but determined. As the days went on, their training sessions became a routine. Samantha improved quickly, her natural stubbornness working in her favor. Regis, however, found himself distracted. Watching her fight, seeing her push through pain and exhaustion, only deepened the feelings he was trying so hard to suppress. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Regis handed her a bottle of water. She took it, their fingers brushing for a moment longer than necessary. "Thanks," she murmured, avoiding his gaze. "You're doing well," he said, his voice softer than usual. Samantha looked up at him, her defenses lowered. "Why do you care so much, Regis? About me, I mean." He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Because I can't afford to lose you," he finally admitted. The vulnerability in his voice startled her. For the first time, she saw the man behind the billionaire facade, a man who was just as terrified of his emotions as she was. Samantha's training was put to the test sooner than she expected. One evening, as she sat in the estate's library, the power suddenly went out. The darkness was suffocating, and an eerie silence settled over the house. Regis burst into the room, his face grim. "Stay here," he ordered. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. "There's been a breach," he said, pulling a gun from his waistband. "Stay hidden. Don't come out until I come back for you." Before she could argue, he was gone. Samantha's heart pounded as she crouched behind a bookshelf, clutching a heavy book as if it could somehow protect her. Minutes felt like hours as she listened to the sounds of shouting and footsteps echoing through the estate. Suddenly, the library door creaked open. She held her breath, her grip tightening on the book. A shadow moved across the room, and she prepared to strike. "Samantha, it's me," Regis's voice called out, calm but urgent. She dropped the book, relief washing over her as he stepped into view. "What happened?" "Lorenzo's men," he said, his expression dark. "They've been dealt with, but this isn't over." Samantha stood, her legs shaking. "I thought you said this place was secure." "It was," Regis said bitterly. "They must have had inside help." The realization sent a chill down Samantha's spine. "What now?" "Now," Regis said, taking her hand, "we prepare for war." That night, as they sat in the study, going over security plans and contingency measures, Samantha realized just how far she had come. She was no longer the defiant captive, nor was Regis just the cold-hearted billionaire. They were partners now, bound by danger, trust, and an undeniable connection that neither could ignore. The days following the breach were tense. Regis tightened security around the estate, doubling the number of guards and installing advanced surveillance systems. Samantha felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She could see the exhaustion etched into Regis's face and the frustration boiling beneath his calm exterior. One evening, as they sat in the study, Regis was reviewing security reports when Samantha placed a hand on his arm. "You can't keep doing this to yourself," she said softly. He looked up at her, his eyes shadowed with worry. "If I don't, who will? Lorenzo won't stop until he gets what he wants. And that means you." Samantha hesitated before replying, her voice trembling slightly. "I never asked for this, Regis. I never wanted to be in the middle of your feud with Lorenzo." Regis leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You didn't ask for this, but you're here. and I can't let anything happen to you." The intensity of his words caught Samantha off guard. She searched his face, trying to decipher the emotions hidden behind his stoic mask. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you care so much?" Regis's jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked as if he was going to deflect the question, but then he sighed. "Because you're not just anyone, Samantha. You're different. You make me feel things I've tried to ignore for years." Samantha's heart raced at his confession, but before she could respond, one of Regis's men burst into the room. "Boss, we've got trouble," the guard said urgently. "Lorenzo's men are on the move." Regis stood immediately, his demeanor shifting into one of unyielding authority. "Prepare the team. Samantha, stay here." "No," she said, standing as well. "I'm coming with you." "Samantha, this isn't a debate," he said firmly. "And I'm not asking for permission," she shot back, her eyes blazing with determination. Regis stared at her for a long moment before nodding. "Fine, but stay close to me." The estate's perimeter was a flurry of activity as Regis and his team prepared for Lorenzo's next move. Samantha felt out of place amidst the armed guards and high-tech equipment, but she refused to back down. She wasn't going to let Regis face this alone. As the night deepened, the tension became almost unbearable. Then, the first sign of an attack came. A loud explosion near the eastern gate. "Stay behind me," Regis ordered as he led Samantha toward the command center. The estate erupted into chaos as Lorenzo's men launched their assault. Regis barked orders to his team, his voice steady despite the danger. Samantha watched in awe as he took control of the situation, his confidence unwavering. But then the unthinkable happened. A group of intruders managed to breach the inner grounds. Regis and Samantha found themselves cornered in one of the estate's courtyards. "Get behind me," Regis said, pulling out his gun. Samantha refused to cower. Grabbing a nearby metal rod, she stood beside him. "I'm not hiding, Regis." He glanced at her, a mixture of frustration and admiration flashing across his face. "You're impossible," he muttered before turning his focus back to the intruders. The fight was intense. Regis's training paid off as Samantha defended herself, landing a few well-placed blows on their attackers. Regis, however, bore the brunt of the assault, his protective instincts in overdrive. By the time reinforcements arrived, the courtyard was littered with incapacitated intruders. Regis was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, and Samantha was breathing heavily, but they were both alive. As the dust settled, Regis turned to Samantha. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her eyes filled with concern as she examined his injury. "You're the one who's hurt." "It's nothing," he said dismissively. But Samantha wasn't convinced. "You can't keep doing this, Regis. You can't keep putting yourself in danger for me." Regis cupped her face in his hands, his voice low and earnest. "I'd do it 1,000 times over if it meant keeping you safe." The aftermath of the attack left both Regis and Samantha shaken but resolute. They knew that Lorenzo wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, but they were no longer willing to live in fear. Regis called a meeting with his team the next morning. "We're not waiting for Lorenzo to make the next move. It's time we take the fight to him." Samantha watched as his men nodded in agreement, their loyalty to him unwavering. She felt a surge of pride for the man who had risked everything to protect her. That night, as they sat by the fireplace in the estate's living room, Samantha finally allowed herself to relax. Regis sat beside her, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Why do you keep fighting for me?" she asked, breaking the silence. Regis looked at her, his expression softening. "Because I care about you, Samantha, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time." Tears welled up in her eyes at his words. "You've changed me, Regis. I never thought I could trust someone like this." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "You're not alone in this anymore. Whatever happens, we face it together." In that moment, Samantha realized that she wasn't just a pawn in Regis's game against Lorenzo. She was his partner, his equal, and maybe even his salvation. As the fire crackled in the background, they leaned into each other, their connection stronger than ever. But they knew that the real battle was still ahead, and they would need each other more than ever to face it. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.